All right, let's get started. Can you introduce yourself for the tape?
Yeah, I'm Dr. Brian Willoughby. I'm a professor in the School of Family Life at Brigham Young University. I study teen and adolescent dating, and I believe that online pornography is a major issue we need to be talking more about with that group.
Yeah, I happen to agree with you. Just given a lot of the mentoring I do of young people. I know for you talk about this stuff all the time. I imagine for a lot of listeners, it's kind of an awkward conversation. I'm going to ask you, can you just expand on why is this such an important conversation for us to be having right now?
Yeah, I think it starts with understanding that pornography has really changed in the last 20 years. I think for most parents that maybe grew up in the 80s and 90s, certainly pornography existed, but it was a very different type of pornography. It was the Playboys, the penthouses, the odd DVD here and there. Online pornography, Pornhub, X Video, it's a very different type of format, and because of that difference, it's really flooded adolescence. This isn't something that teens come across a couple times, from 10 to 18. It's something that they're consistently encountering and engaging with at a very rapid rate. And so it has a much larger impact on their sexual development than it has in previous generations.
So I want to ask you how we got here, but I also can you give us a sense of the numbers? Like what proportion of young people are interacting with pornography? How often? For how long? What's the upshot of that?
Yeah, obviously there's going to be a lot of variation, just like any other behavior. But I think there's a couple key numbers to keep in mind. Number one is most kids encounter pornography for the first time between 10 and 12. So it's fairly early on. That's kind of average first encounter. And then by the time kids are 18 and kind of launching into adulthood, the engagement rate for young men is about 70-80% on a regular basis. That's not just like I came across porn. I'm using porn. It's part of a regular behavioral pattern. 70-80% of young men by the time they're 18 are using, and about 50 to 60% of young adult women. And so when you kind of put those two things together, again, there's a lot of variation from 10 to 18, but it gives you a sense of how it starts very young and how for most people it's pretty normative to get to a regular use pattern by the time they're adults. And by the time you get to 18, 19, 20, most young adult men, we still see a gender difference, but most young adult men typically viewing a couple hours of porn per week.
Hmm. And how does that compare to the past?
Well, we don't have awesome numbers in the past. Again, part of that was because access was a lot different. Again, in previous generations before the internet, before kind of mainstream free online pornography, I had to go physically get something. I had to go find a DVD. I had to go find a magazine. And so, even though exposure, the data we have suggests that exposure and engagement with pornography by 18 was probably pretty similar. 80, 90%, maybe close to 100% by the time we get to 20 of young adult men and women had seen some form of pornography by then. It's really the frequency that's changed. And again, we don't have great frequency numbers from 30, 40 years ago. But just from what we can see from 2004-ish, from the advent of the smartphone and the internet to today and the increases we've seen, suggests that we've seen a fairly large increase in engagement.
So, I mean, the numbers you're talking about kind of pretty staggering. So, like 70 to 80% of young men at 18 are regular users consuming a couple of hours every week. And then 50 to 60% of young women are regular users as well. Now, how do we get here? So, like, I think this is a pretty common story, right? So, like, no matter the substance, and I think about porn as a substance, right? We've seen a radical change in both access and potency, and I imagine it's a similar story here. And then the internet, right, and mobile phones combine to make it almost ubiquitously accessible almost anywhere. But there's also a change you talked about in the nature of the pornography itself. Can you talk a little bit about how that porn has changed specifically over time?
Yeah, there's kind of two big things that have been changing. Um, One is it goes back to format, right? Is now pornography is housed online, obviously, and it has so many different mechanisms. It has the porn hubs, the kind of clearinghouse websites out there. You have OnlyFans, you have cam sites, you have the amount is probably the best way to kind of talk about it. The amount of pornography and sexual material online is staggering. And as you mentioned, the other thing that's really changed is access. Um, the access to these online portals is very easy, even among states that have tried to put some sort of regulation and age verification laws in place. They're very easy to get around VPNs, etc. And so that access and the amount is one of the things that's really, I think, changed the behavior. The other thing that I think is really important to keep in mind is content has shifted too. And there's been some good studies that have looked at content longitudinally over time that have suggested that pornography is generally getting more violent, particularly towards women. And so a lot of more aggressive behaviors. Now, a lot of that is oftentimes focused on things that are like spanking, choking. Though there's a recent study that came out that showed that choking behaviors have been increasing. I think that's another a specific change that a lot of scholars have kind of noted as concerning. That this isn't just more access to sexual material, but the types of sexual material that particularly young kids are getting access to looks like it might be more aggressive, and that's one of the main concerns when it comes to pornography.
So I think a lot of people listening, I think that second part, right? There's a lot of implicit risk in that, but how do we get to that point? Like, why is it that it doesn't necessarily linearly track that because there's more porn and more porn usage, that you need more extreme porn to exist? But can you talk a little bit about why the current influx of pornography has created this more extreme version, and why we think it's changing?
Yeah, and to be clear, I think all types of sexual content are increasing. This isn't just that, say, coupled sexual behavior in porn has been on the decline. I think content in general has been increasing. What we're seeing is just more interest and more engagement. A lot of these studies, what they do is they're looking at what's the most commonly consumed videos on these sites. And within those videos, that's what we're seeing is the increase. And so I think the best way to kind of talk about this is it's not that all of a sudden there's a lot of aggressive pornographic content online. That's always been the case. I think what's changing is people's interest in it. And
Mm.
it's an interesting conversation to have to say, well, why is that? I think part of it is maybe the anonymity of online spaces, that when I can access sexual content without anyone knowing, I might be more inclined to be curious about things that are more taboo, things that I wouldn't necessarily ask a partner to do, things I wouldn't talk to my parents or my friends about. I think young teens and young adults are feeling more free in their online spaces. They're feeling more able to explore this type of content, which might be one of the reasons why they're raising in popularity. And like any media, when there's interest, consumer interest, you'll see the producers respond to that. Say, hey, if there's interest in this type of content, let's produce more of it. Another example in online spaces is that typically one of the most common categories is incest porn. Stepdaughters, stepfathers, stepmothers, etc. I think that's another kind of taboo topic where they saw consumers interested in it or curious about it, and we've seen most sexually explicit producers of that sort of content really respond and kind of flood these sites with that sort of content. So I think there's a lot of factors at play. I do think that anonymity plays a part. I think the curiosity plays a part, and then there's just the business side of these producers and businesses responding to that curiosity.
Yeah. I What's the consequence? I mean, I think for a lot of people listening, they might say, "Well, okay, so people are looking at more porn. It's not great that people are looking um, at more extreme material." But if it stays online and folks are consuming it there, why the concern?
I think that's a great question. It's one that I get all the time. And generally speaking, with pornography, like any form of media, right, is the concern sometimes is socialization. Is that I'm watching something, I'm potentially shifting my expectations, my ideas about intimacy and relationships. That's always been at kind of the crux of the pornography research. One of the reasons why we think we see later in adulthood people that regularly view pornography tend to have less stable relationships, less happy relationships, because what I'm seeing in pornography doesn't really replicate in my human relationships. Although those effects are generally small. I think the main concern that's growing now with kids, particularly teens, goes back to some of those numbers I shared with you earlier. Is when young kids are starting to engage with pornography at really young ages, 10, 11, 12, 13, right? That's prepubescent, right at the beginning of puberty, and then regularly engaging with sexually explicit material all the way up to 18 and 19. When you combine that with the fact that actual romantic relationship behavior and sexual activity rates are been declining in that same age group. So that group's actually having less sex, dating way less than they have in previous generations. What that means is now there's this very critical period during adolescence where the main educator and socializer for teens when it comes to romantic and sexual relationships is pornography. And that's obviously a larger concern because I think most people as adults understand that, hey, pornography is not really showing me what real relationships are like. The way I describe it sometimes in educational settings is these are non-normal looking people doing non-normative acts in non-normative settings. And most adults kind of understand the fantasy of pornography, but a 14-year-old doesn't, right? If I'm
Hmm.
14, 15, I've had no real sexual experience, no real dating experience. For me, porn might be what I think real life is like, particularly if that's what I'm consuming on a regular basis for years and years and years. Um, and so that's the primary concern is, and we are seeing it in some longitudinal data where now young adults that have had a consistent kind of diet of porn throughout their adolescent years tend to have more negative men, for example, have more negative attitudes towards women,
Mm.
more aggressive attitudes towards women. They have more unrealistic views about intimacy and sex. And they're kind of setting themselves up for dissatisfaction in their adult relationships because these adult relationships can't replicate what I've been viewing and probably masturbating to for 10 years.
Yeah. Are we seeing that spill over into real life? You talked about the higher age at sexual debut. You talk about the fact that young people are having less sex than young people of previous generations. Um, what about the ways that folks are interacting? Are we seeing more of the kind of, we'll just say, pornified behavior spill over into real life? Beyond attitudes and age at sex. Are we seeing more reports of violent sex and abusive kinds of relationships?
Yeah, there's kind of a couple pieces that have been coming out. There's some longitudinal research that suggests that heavy pornography use can be or increase the likelihood of more aggressive behaviors in the bedroom. But I want to be careful that the research hasn't necessarily said it's increasing violent or abusive relationships. That kind of one to one causal relationship hasn't really been established. But certainly, like I said, kind of attitudes and behaviors. And then I think when you look at a broader scope, there are some specific behaviors that we can look at that clearly have a connection with a more kind of pornified view of relationships. The easy one I point to a lot is anal sex, because that's a very common behavior now in most sexually explicit videos. But we know it's a behavior that most women, in particular, if we're talking about heterosexual relationships, we know that the vast majority of women don't enjoy. The vast majority of women find painful. But we are seeing a sharp increase in that behavior among heterosexual couples that we assume, it's not that all of a sudden these couples are like, hey, let's try this. We would assume that it's coming because the vast majority of them have seen it in porn. It's almost everything in porn is portrayed as an enjoyable experience for both partners. And so we can kind of see that more one to one. Hey, clearly here's a behavior that's started to enter a lot of relationships. That's probably because of pornography. And generally, that speaks to an issue we see with a lot of young adult and adult couples now, where we have now a generation that was kind of raised on this online pornography, where couples now have to negotiate this. It's something where both partners probably came in with some experience with pornography, particularly the male partner. Again, if we're talking about heterosexual couples, and now they have to navigate. Okay, do I stop viewing porn? Do we view it together, which more and more couples are doing? How does this influence our intimacy and our relationship? And there's basically a whole nother level to adult relationships now, where you have to figure out the rules and the boundaries around pornography that previous generations didn't have to figure out. So there are certainly some indicators that it's really starting to impact kind of the relationships of couples later in life. And then on the other side, I think the other thing where clearly see the impact is the extension of what I said before is not just less dating and less sex in adolescence, but throughout the entire life course. Now, young
Mm.
adult dating, teen pregnancy, marriage rates, fertility, I mean, kind of across the board, anything that's about human connection has been decreasing. And I don't think that's just about pornography. I think that's about AI. I think that's about social media. I think that's about all these digital spaces that people are being socialized around and engaging with that make human relationships and engagement less appealing because they're not as engaging, they're not as personalized, they're not as customizable as what I get online.